get started here, I should let you know I have an avatar now. It was done by Jazz Ride. He's a good friend of mine and a talented artist. Link to his Instagram in the description if you want to see his work and maybe get a commission of your own. Anyway, on to the video. I've talked about Danganronpa a lot in the last 3 years. I know it can get annoying for some, but I do really like these games and just happen to find a lot of good opportunities to talk about them. Besides, I usually find a way to talk about something different each time. One thing that's been pretty consistent though is my disdain for V3. I've made it no secret that this is my least favorite game in the series, at least as far as the main trilogy goes. And while I've elaborated a little bit on why that is, it's not something that can be summed up in 30 seconds of a countdown segment, so I figured this topic warranted its own video. Now, just a couple disclaimers before we get into this. For starters, I do still like V3 and think it's worth your time, just not as much as the original two. Also, despite the inflammatory title, this video isn't meant to prove that this is the worst game or anything. This is just why I like it the least. Finally, this should go without saying, but I'm gonna be spoiling the entire game here, so if for some godforsaken reason you're watching this video without having played the game yet, what the hell are you doing? Leave, unless you really don't care about spoilers. With all that out of the way, on to the review. Before I start tearing into this game, I do want to give it a little credit. There are a few areas where V3 is actually better than the previous games. The most obvious of these areas is the presentation, specifically the visuals. The first two games were originally made for the PSP, while V3 was made for the PS4, so it makes sense that V3 looks better than the first two. It's not super noticeable, and the old games don't look bad or anything, but there's just something about V3's graphics that feels cleaner and higher quality than the first two. The interface here is also the best in the series. It's much more stylish and doesn't do anything stupid like make you read the character's name sideways. Seriously, who thought that was a good idea? The biggest UI change, though, is how the dialogue is handled. The first two games took the traditional visual novel approach and showed only one character on screen at a time. V3 does things a bit differently. Now, the characters are in comic book panels that shift around the screen to accommodate what's going on. This makes the dialogue feel more lively and lets the game get certain points across more effectively. When there's a big group discussion, it feels bigger because you can see more of the characters. Then, of course, there's the matter of the main character. The first two games were completely first person outside of the trial segments, and while this game is also first person, now you actually see your character when they're talking. This is a huge step up because in the first two games, connecting with Makoto and Hajime was kind of an uphill battle since you could only really see them or hear their voices during the trials. Now that you're actually able to see the main character's reactions to things, it makes them much easier to sympathize with. It isn't just the presentation though, this game's also got the best bonus content. I don't really play the bonus content in Danganronpa, but there's no denying that this game has the best array of bonus modes. In addition to an enhanced version of the free time events, you've also got a Mario Party style board game that lets you play as any character in the series, not counting Ultra Despair Girls or the Mana Cubs. I haven't played much of it, but it has its own slew of mechanics and a lot of dialogue moments, leading to some pretty ambitious crossovers. And on top of that, there's the dungeon crawler mode, which I know nothing about, but it's there, and those are really the only two things V3 does better than the others. On to the trial mechanics. V3 made a lot of changes to the trials. Some were good, others not so much. Starting with the minigames they changed, there were a few improvements. This game has the best version of Hangman's Gambit. It's more complex than the original, but not a total mess like in Danganronpa 2. And Psych Taxi is essentially Logic Drive, but much less frustrating, which I'm thankful for. Unfortunately, Rebuttal Showdown didn't fare as well. In the original Rebuttal Showdown, you just swiped the control stick in a direction to swing the sword, while now you have to aim the sword and press A to swing it. This isn't a huge deal, but the change kind of misses the point of the minigame. It's all about cutting through the stream of nonsense your opponent is spewing at you. It needs to feel fast-paced, so making you line up your shots instead of just letting you go to town kinda takes away from that feeling. Once again, it's not a huge deal, but it's still a downgrade. So what are there in terms of new mechanics? There's Mind Mine, which I hate. It's overly complicated, and I wasn't even sure what I was supposed to do at first. Then there's the lying mechanic, which adds to the game's theme of lies being useful. That's about it though. It's rarely used and the game will outright tell you when to use it, which is good because it would be impossible to figure out otherwise. Mass panic debates were a lot of fun, forcing you to focus on multiple conversations at once. Then finally, there's the scrum debates. Whenever everyone seems split down the middle on an issue, their podiums will move, leading the two sides to face off with each other, and you control the arguments your side makes. That sounds cool, and it kind of is, but these things only happen once per trial and feel like they're over way too fast. Anyway, now on to the outright bad stuff. In any game that revolves around being trapped somewhere, the setting is incredibly important. The first two Danganronpa games have great settings for very different reasons. Hope's Peak in the original is dark and claustrophobic. The windows are boarded up, and any hints of the outside world are merely illusions. Despite the school itself actually being pretty colorful, it constantly makes you feel trapped and on edge. You're constantly worrying about who's gonna die next, and relishing every new floor you gain access to out of desperation for just a little more space. Danganronpa 2's Jabberwock Island works for the exact opposite reason. It's an island that connects to 5 larger islands that open up as the game progresses. All these islands allow for a lot more variety in locations, and by extension, murder scenarios. Unlike Hope's Peak, Jabberwock Island is actually pretty relaxing, making you almost feel like you're on vacation. That sounds like a bad thing, but it really works because it lures you into a false sense of security. That way, it hits you even harder when someone winds up dead. V3's Ultimate Academy feels like it was trying to go for a best of both worlds approach. You're restricted to a building again, fitting with the original's feeling of entrapment, and there are special talent labs for each character, fitting with the variety of Danganronpa 2. However, while trying to achieve both, the game accomplishes neither. Let's start with the isolation of the original. That unsettling feeling of imprisonment doesn't work when you can see daylight. V3 flat out lets you go outside! Yeah, you're still blocked by a wall, but the original's claustrophobia goes away the moment you leave the building. It's not really present in the building either. There are parts of the building missing, allowing sunlight in, and there's vegetation everywhere. Generally speaking, plants are very calming and tend to take away from an oppressive indoor atmosphere. So putting them all throughout the building is the last thing you want to do if you're trying to make things feel claustrophobic and uncomfortable. As for the talent labs, they're a cool idea, but they feel underutilized. In Danganronpa 2, each new island felt like a whole new world, and with each murder, the island it was on felt like an integral part of the case. Even when the locations don't play much of a role in the mystery, they add so much to the feel of it. The talent labs obviously can't provide that scope of variety, and they feel inconsequential. Yes, many of them had items that contributed to the cases, but the only case where the labs really felt like a big factor was the second one. Also, whose bright idea was it to include the mysterious objects? You know, the ones you get after each trial that made you have to play scavenger hunt to unlock the new rooms? It was so annoying trying to figure out where these items went, even if a lot of the unlocking animations were cool. I've said on numerous occasions that V3 has the weakest cast of the bunch, and I think the best way to illustrate this is to go over each character individually in the most logical order I can think of. Rantaro is alright. His entire character feels like a mystery box waiting to be cracked open, and he was cracked open much more literally before he could make much of an impression on me. Seriously, I felt like I had really gotten to know Sayaka and fake Byakuya by the time they died, but this guy was just kinda there. I really liked Kaede. While the twist with her was insanely clever, I honestly would have preferred it if she had stayed the main character. Everything from her warm, cheery attitude to her actual identifiable talent to, you know, being a girl, really set her apart from the protagonists of the other games. As opposed to Shuichi, who, well, we'll get to him later. Ryoma was cool and interesting. Even though it makes sense to kill him this early, I really wish he lasted longer. Kurumi was pretty boring. Her relationship with Kokichi was kind of nice, but I feel like she needed more screen time for me to really care about her. I felt nothing at the end of her trial, which is really saying something compared to the second trials in the other games. Angie is annoying as hell. Her Atua shtick gets old fast and her voice does not help. Tenko is also kind of annoying. I'll admit, her crush on Himiko is kind of endearing, but her rampant misandry really isn't. And since that's the bulk of her personality, it makes for a generally obnoxious character with an occasional tender moment. Korekiyo was pretty interesting. I like the smart, sophisticated vibe he gave everything, and his sudden turn at the end of Trial 3 was freaking hilarious. Mew was a character I didn't really like at first. She could be pretty obnoxious, but it's done in a pretty hilarious and endearing way. Part of me wishes I found a spot for her on my best characters list. Gota is freaking adorable and has the saddest death in the game. Kokichi is the best character here. I don't think I need to explain why. I liked Kaito quite a bit. I hear some complain that he can be kind of an idiot and get mad at you for stupid reasons, and that is a fair criticism, but this guy's enthusiasm is so infectious, it's hard not to like it. Tsumugi feels like a background character. Her only character trait is going along with whatever anyone else says, which I guess makes sense for the twist villain. After all, fake Junko was kinda generic too, but she could get away with that because she dies so early, and she still had more personality. Here, we're just left with a bland, forgettable character for most of the game, and when she does get revealed as the villain, she's easily the weakest in the series, not counting the anime. Speaking of bland and forgettable, we have Kibo. His personality is the fact he's a robot. He doesn't act comically robotic or anything, just really generic, and he mentions the fact he's a robot from time to time. We see a bunch of new functions from him as the game progresses, instead of personality traits. The only time he really has any personality is when he's responding to Kokichi's insults, and even then, his reactions aren't nearly as funny as Mew's. I get that he's part of the big twist, but much like with Tsumugi, that doesn't make up for him being a nothing character for most of the game. I've already stated my piece on Himiko and least favorite characters. The TLDR is that there's a major disconnect between the way she's written and her design and voice. Now, someone pointed out to me that Himiko's lack of enthusiasm is because she's depressed, which makes sense, but I don't think that explains the disconnect with her dialogue, and it definitely doesn't make her an interesting character to me. Maki is a character that a lot of the fandom seems to hate, and I get why. She's a bit cliche, and despite wanting to turn over a new leaf, she doesn't really show remorse for the people she's killed, and frequently threatens to kill others as a quirky little catchphrase. Those are all fair critiques, but I honestly liked her. It was fun seeing her go from a giant question mark to trying to open up to Kaito and Shuichi, and eventually getting attached to them. Finally, we have Shuichi. He's not a bad character, but I really wish he wasn't the protagonist. He's just too similar to Makoto and Hajime. All three of them are scrawny, unassuming dudes with low self-confidence, largely stemming from their talent. With Makoto, it's because he had the luck talent and didn't see how it was useful. With Hajime, he didn't have a talent, and with Shuichi, he has a real talent, but is ashamed of it. So that's everyone, right? Nope. I still gotta talk about the mascot characters. The Monokubs seem to be the most universally hated aspect of this game, and I can see why. A lot of people find them annoying, but I think they're fine personality-wise. In fact, Monodum is among my top 5 favorite characters in the game. The issue with the Monokubs is that they serve no real purpose in the story. I mean, just look at the far superior version of them, Monami. Not only does she serve as a great comedic foil to Monokuma, and a likable character in her own right, but she also has a purpose in the story. She serves as a connection to the mysterious Future Foundation and the traitor among you. The game tries to keep you guessing about whose side she's really on, and the idea of a threat other than Monokuma adds a lot to the story. Nothing about the Monokubs really goes anywhere, so they just kind of eat up time that could be spent on other characters, mainly Monokuma. Speaking of which, Monokuma doesn't have nearly the same intimidation factor or stage presence in this game that he did in the other two. And I think a lot of that is because so many of his usual responsibilities wind up getting delegated to the Monokubs. From morning announcements, to enforcing the rules, to even just the regular interactions with the students. He takes such a backseat role that he barely feels like the villain anymore. The Monokuma theater segments are pretty great though. The references to popular movies are funny, most of the segments are clever, and his speech on the meaning of life is unironically fantastic. These segments are the one time in the game where Monokuma feels like his old self. In the rest of the game, he mostly feels like a tired old man who doesn't want to do this anymore. And considering the ending, maybe that's intentional, but it doesn't make for a good villain. So yeah, V3's cast isn't awful. I still liked about half the characters, but there were far more I hated than in the other two, and this game is a terrible judge of who should live and who should die. Okay, so the final element of V3 to go over is the story. Now, I was originally going to go over the trials and the overarching story separately, but they're so interconnected it would be tough to separate them. Besides, I think you all have a good idea of how I feel about the trials by now. Time to go through this chapter by chapter. The prologue is really nothing special. I guess it didn't need to be since it's just getting things set up, but it lasts pretty long, and unlike Danganronpa 2's prologue that plays with your expectations in really creative ways, this one is just kinda confusing. It's not a huge deal, but unlike the first two games, it just left me wondering when we were gonna get to the killing game. Chapter 1 is actually pretty good. The Death Road to Despair is an interesting new idea, although it's a total nightmare for completionists. The chapter sets up a lot of interesting dynamics, making you wonder what the deal is with so many of the characters. Rentaro, Ryoma, Shuichi, Kaito, Maki, Kokichi. I was left wondering what all of their roles were going to be. There's also this weird moment where the Monokubs accidentally kill Monokuma, and the game tries to make you think he's staying dead. Now, if you've played the other games, you know how empty this thread is, but I honestly wish they kept him dead for a while. Have the Monokubs run the game for a few chapters, and then have Monokuma come back midway through the game. That way, it could be a signal to the cast that things just got serious, and give Monokuma a much more intimidating presence. I know it's a bold move, but it's better than what we got, with the Monokubs being pointless and Monokuma feeling like a non-issue. And then of course there's the time limit Monokuma puts on everyone, which adds a nice layer of suspense. Sure, it's essentially just a far less unsettling version of the Funhouse, but it still works. As for the trial, it's really good and the twist is brilliant, but again, I think it was a big mistake to have Shuichi be the real protagonist. A fan actually pointed out the perfect way to get the best of both worlds on the issue. Have everything play out the same, but switch the roles. Have Shuichi be the fake out that gets killed and Kaede be the real main character. Not only does this leave you with the better, more unique main character, but it also makes the twist an even bigger shock. Since Shuichi gives off serious protagonist energy, no one would question him being the main character. Chapter 2 starts off with arguably the worst part of this game's story, the flashback lights. I don't know how controversial this is, but Danganronpa tends to be at its weakest when it focuses on what's going on outside of the killing game. I didn't care at all about the flashbacks these things showed, and honestly kinda hated them, which is a major problem because they're the main thing V3's overarching mystery hinges on. The rest of the chapter is pretty good though. It shows us the start of Kaito and Shuichi's friendship, as well as the beginning of Kokichi's villainous streak. Plus, the motive, while recycled from the original, has enough of a spin to keep it fresh and interesting. As for the trial itself, there's not a lot to say about it. It's just really good, and I honestly wish I put it higher on my list. Chapter 3 is a whole smorgasbord of missed opportunities. Yeah, every chapter 3 in this series leaves me wishing things had played out differently, but it's especially bad here. For starters, the Monokubs actually take over the killing game, with Monodum being the hilariously authoritarian leader. You'd think this would be some sort of big plot development, but no. Monokuma retakes control with no resistance before the trial even starts. I mean, come on, at least give my man some time leading a trial. Next is the motive. It's an Necronomicon that can bring people back from the dead. Now, I know that wouldn't actually work, because while Danganronpa has plenty of sci-fi elements, magic isn't really something they deal with. Still, that just leaves me wondering what they would do if someone used it and how that would change the dynamic. Instead, Angie dies before it can be used. Speaking of which, the biggest missed opportunity in this chapter is the student council. Angie essentially starts a cult to Atua that she indoctrinates half the remaining students into and uses it to seize power under the guise of preventing deaths. Instead of having to fight to break everyone from her grip, she just dies. And her death has nothing to do with the student council. Can you imagine how powerful it would have been if Angie was the killer? Like, maybe she would have killed Tenko for stepping out of line. Sure, the culprit would be pretty obvious, but that wouldn't be the challenge of the trial. The challenge would be combating Angie's manipulations and trying to break the others from her spell. The scrub debates were practically built for this scenario. Instead, all that potential was thrown away in favor of another double murder, development for a boring character that stayed boring, and a killer who was still pretty damn obvious. This is the first time they entertained the possibility of there being two killers, and Monokuma confirms that if there were, only one would be executed. executed. Now that's gotta set up some serious tension, with everyone having to get along with someone who's killed one of their friends. We'll never get to see that scenario though, because it turns out both victims were just killed by the same guy. At least we got the Kokichi fake out. I have minimal complaints with Chapter 4. I'm not a fan of how we get this really cool new floor and it plays virtually no role in the trials, and I really wish Mew turned out to be one of the survivors, but other than that, this chapter's pretty good. It builds up Kokichi as a legitimate threat. The Neo World segment is pretty fun, and the trial is easily the best in the game. Chapter 5 is a really mixed bag. Half of it is Kokichi being a really intimidating villain, which is awesome, but the other half mostly leans on the flashback light, which I hate. Also, since he kidnaps Kaito at the beginning, that means you're stuck with the survivor gang for essentially the whole chapter. From here on out, the cast consists of Maki, who's pretty good, and 3 of the worst characters in the entire series. Yeah, late game V3 is not fun. As for Chapter 5's trial, I also have really mixed feelings on it. On one hand, it does have some really unique elements, like the victim being a mystery and working with Monokuma to figure out the killer. At the same time though, this trial is a blatant ripoff of Danganronpa 2's 5th case. This brings me to an issue I have with the trials in this game as a whole. They're too similar to Danganronpa 2. Sure, Danganronpa 2 had a decent amount of parallels to the first game, but this is just too much. The first case has the most mysterious character in the game being killed by the unassuming best friend of the main character. Case 2 involves a fairly emotionless character with a black and white color scheme killing someone to serve someone else. Case 3 has a deranged lunatic killing 2 people and is easily the worst in the game. Case 4 focuses more on the rules of the location you're in, and Case 5 has the game's most sinister character constructing a purposely unsolvable murder. Even the first 4 executions have a weird amount of parallels. While some of these cases are really good, I think they really should have tried to mix things up more, because this feels painfully formulaic. What doesn't feel painfully formulaic is the final chapter. In fact, it starts off pretty promising. Kibo gets a bunch of upgrades and starts tearing the school apart while the Monokubs try to stop him. And you have to explore the school and have him blast away any doors that were previously unopened. They mix up the gameplay here, which I actually like quite a bit. My only issue is the room with the desks. You have to use a mechanic introduced in this game that lets you push away objects. But since this is the only time you've been forced to use it, you probably won't even remember it exists, let alone how to use it. Blasting down the doors is cathartic though, and the information they yield is interesting. Too bad most of it's irrelevant, because we find out in the final trial that all the backstory— it's a lie! I'm not gonna go over the final case here, because I went over it at length in my Every Trial Ranked video. All I'm gonna say is it's an overall miserable end to a pretty mediocre story. There were a few things about the story I did like. The beginning was fun, the friendship between Shuichi, Maki, and Kaito was really sweet, and Kokichi's a great villain. But that's about it. I think the main issue here is that the game doesn't raise interesting questions. The questions raised in the first 2 games were interesting because they tied directly into the killing game. Who's running it? Who's this traitor? What's the deal with the 16th student? Who is the Future Foundation? Why is Monokuma a god now? All of these are interesting and tied directly into the game everyone's been forced to play. The questions in V3 are mostly raised by things like the flashback lights that tie into the world building and the outside world, which doesn't work because Danganronpa is pretty bad at world building. I mean, let's be real, the apocalypse in the first 2 games is so over the top and ridiculous that it only works because you don't have to deal with it for most of the game, and Junko's such a charismatic and absurd villain, she makes it make sense in a nonsensical way. And even then, she only really makes it believable in the second game. In the first, it's still kinda stupid. Here, the world building is put front and center, and it's the main thing you're supposed to be kept in suspense over. Meanwhile, almost no new developments are made with the killing game, with even the good stuff leaning too heavily on previous games. The story's essentially staking itself on the series' biggest weakness while neglecting one of the series' biggest strengths. Combine that with the game being an absolutely terrible judge of who should live and who should die, cutting off potentially interesting arcs and leaving us with some of the worst characters in the franchise in the final chapter, add in a shark jump of an ending that'll make you never want to see a 4th wall break again, and boom, that's a recipe for disaster. So I think it's pretty easy to see why I think Danganronpa V3 is the weakest in the trilogy. It's It's still a good game, but it's got so many problems, and as a result, it's leagues behind the other two. I consider Danganronpa 1 and 2 must-plays, while V3 is something you can play if you really like the first two and want another game like it, but you don't have to. It's not that great. I am Defoffilizer, and now you know my issues with V3.